I'm a bit confused. About the use of the triangle and the triple contingency and its relationship to the data. And the confusion seems to come or emerge from the goals and perceptions of metastability. If you want metastability, how much metastability do you want? If you have too much of it, you have a fossilization of the social system. In terms of imperialism, you have a dictatorship sort of structure. On the other side, if you want innovation and creativity, you must abandon at least part of the metastability. And so given the triangle and whatever that might mean in this context, and I'm very uncertain what you mean by it, how do you balance the two parts of stability, that which seeks growth and development versus that which insists upon safety and security?
So, Caroline here. Do you want me to answer myself, or because I'm not sure I could answer for Loet and how Loet understands it. I completely agree that with Jerry's comment, because indeed, what we want in a system where you're seeking novelty and innovation, you want to enable or allow self-organization to be facilitated and enabled, right? So because it is indeed, as people follow their curiosity and then seek that complementarity of idea from another, that we have have new ideas or variability, let's say, introduced into the system. Now, we'd have to ask Loet about this, but it is indeed, when you look at network structures, that it is indeed when a third connection or a third possible connection is added that you have a greater chance of variability than you do with two, right? Because, and actually I studied the Nobel Prize winning networks in this way. And what we found is that researchers of equal stature and elite status who had more closed networks, right, where they were working mostly with people in their own field, and that you could see a kind of a connection mostly with people within their own field, were not as noted by others in their field as the Nobel Prize winners. Nobel Prize winners were much more likely to create a network in which they reached out across and created kind of triangular or multiple relationships with people that, that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to speak to, right? And so they sought out variability, and they did that in ways that would create what we might call triangular relationships or extended relationships, and so therefore were noted as having contributed more to new knowledge than other elite researchers. So the question about metastability, right? Because we do in fact see that in our societies we create metastable systems, and sometimes they do become overbearing, and even networks can become too constraining, where we're in a network and therefore the network is so dense that the density makes it very hard to create a new connection or a new combination. And so, the metastability or even too much density in a network can inhibit the kinds of reorganization and recombinations that create the variability that we're looking for. So I don't know that that's getting to an answer. I do think that there has to be a balance between enabling self-organization and retaining some knowledge and structure within the system. And where that falls, I'm not sure. And maybe this is where Loet's equations help us to understand that.
Okay, and Andrea had a question. So maybe my comments or my thoughts are also responding to the comment on the metastability. Also, I was actually triggered by one of the formulations you had on your last slide. And let me see if I can reproduce out of my memory, because you asked if we know that there's mechanisms like preferential attachment in place, the things you have empirical shown on the complexity of the systems. So yeah, and if we want to have innovation and novelty, how can we better structure networks for variety? And I think this can be reformulated also in evolutionary theory, evolutionary systems terms, as the almost eternal question on the balance between a selection pressure you have where you wanted to go for the at that time defined optimum, yeah, and a kind of a long tail where you let almost every flowers grow, all flowers grow, but then you actually know that if real innovation comes in the sense that it is not something which is already in the system, then it most likely emerges in this kind of boundaries, long tails, outcasts, kind of strange communities. And at the same time, we all know that we can't, that we cannot have infinite variety, because then we also stuck. Yeah. So I think in evolutionary algorithm theory, people have thought about an optimal window for evolution. So where you have a kind of balance between the rate of mutation and the rate of selection. And then, of course, the big question is, how is this to be implemented in the various systems? And I was wondering, I know that if you look back to science history, and a lot of people have done that, including Loet, that we find a lot of anecdotal evidence about where big ideas are coming from, how is the biography of innovators, and we have that, but I have not been aware of a more recent literature which systematically looks into this and sees if this can be translated or connected to all the nice network analysis we now do with scientific communication. So that means that anecdotally and from history, we know that we need free time, we need programs which are not overly kind of evaluated to avoid that only the kind of mainstream ideas get funded. We know all of that, but how to quantify that and how to bring awareness of this back, I would just be interested if somebody has read something interesting on that score. Yeah, so where's the how much playtime do we need to allow in a system? And if I look at the scientific system or the system of scientific communication, I think the digitization and the internet has rather pushed us towards the side of the almost over optimization of things, yeah, than to enable niche to grow. But it might not be 100% true, because we also see in the digital kind of form other kind of niches emerging. So I'm uncertain about it. I'm just curious what the rest of the group thinks about it, or with what it resonates.
I'm wondering about observable networks. I mean, what is an observable network to second order cybernetics? Is it a thing?
So can I address this? Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
I just want to say, when Mark also say observable network, so there's also an unobservable network. And are you, and Caroline, there's a question for you: to which extent is that also part of your research? Yeah, or when you think about observable network,
Yeah.
which extent do you think about the one that's more difficult to measure, but that's definitely there? Yeah.
Right. These are very important questions. So a network is really just a formalization of social relationships, right? And they do indeed exist on many different levels. However, what is to me very interesting about the study that we have learned about social networks is that they have a universalism about them in measurement. So in other words, there are some things that we know about the probabilities of both the formation of a network and the evolution of networks over time. Just as I showed the Barabasi-Albert equation there, that is very almost a universal law of networks. That is the probability that a new entrant to a network will be connected to another entrant in the network is the extent to which the existing member is already connected. So in other words, there is a probability measure there that just shows up again and again in both physical and social networks. So there are actually quite a number of things we can say about network structures. And when Loet and I worked on the international collaboration networks, and I still work on international collaboration networks, we use the most highly formalized measure, or the most highly formalized indicator in order to do the measurement. In that case, we're using co-authorships on papers. So recognizing that, of course, underneath that kind of highly formalized network, there are indeed many other kinds of personal networks that continue to operate, as Mark wrote in the comments, that there's friendship networks and so on. And we would expect that even in these highly formalized networks, there are kind of latent connections that could be made, right? So somebody who worked together 4 or 5 years ago could re-establish that kind of latent connection within the network, but we would only look at a point in time when we could see a connection that is made in a highly formalized or codified way. So, and I think one of the good things about using codified networks is that it can be reproduced by others. So we create these codified networks based on addresses in papers, and then anyone could indeed recreate that at any other time, rather than basing it on a survey or requesting information about who's connected to whom and why. So that answers part of Mark's question about the network. The interesting thing to me is that when you look at the networks, again, you can see this kind of fractal relationship in network structures. And I think that's also what was interesting to me about the data I showed on the different subsystems, where you can see even across subsystems, there's a power law form, which again suggests that even within the scientific communication system, we have kind of a fractal relationship going on, or fractal nature of connection. So that we would say then that at the highest levels, or the most, the largest way in which we might look at a network, we'll see a power law form, but we'll still see that power law form even at the friendship level, although we haven't really measured that. But the expectation would be that because of the nature of network structures and the fractal relationships in power law forms.
Okay. Well, thank you. I know Jerome wants to ask a question. I'd like to come back to this because I think that there's a connection to the fact that this chapter begins with Freudian psychodynamics, and I think that's something very important there. Which how do these things fit together? Anyway, Jerome.
I don't have the chapter in front of me, but I wanted to respond to some of the points that I've heard here, and also just to say greetings from Valencia, Spain. Just finished a conference here, really wonderful conference on public and social economy. And can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
There were some. No, I think this might be better, probably, right? Yeah. So there was actually some presentations on bibliometric analysis and these types of network aspects in the conference, so relevant to the discussions here. I thought this observation of Caroline's on the Nobel Prize winners and their networks versus other comparable academics was interesting. And it reminded me of, well, on the one hand, we talked about these invisible networks. So I'm thinking of Brennan and Petit's work on the economy of esteem. So you do have esteem as a limited or a scarce good. And so, there are people at the top who, have that, or, as Thomas Merton used to say about the papacy, there's nowhere to go once you're at the top. So I guess you can grease the poles to make it more difficult for others to get up. I think that was his observation. And then I also thought about the Cherokees, the Native Americans who had basically positions within their tribes of basically retired mayors or leaders who were responsible for what we would call today diplomacy. So they had a very special job to develop policies, you would say today, and also to engage in diplomacy. And also, I should mention that the decisions that they made were not binding. So many Western European, I guess, anthropologists observed that you could not bind a Cherokee to any decision made by the leader. So that also, I think, speaks to this notion of hierarchy versus hierarchy. Then to the this question of networks being too stable. I'm thinking about the notion that Robert Ulanovich, who was here a few weeks ago, talks about in his books on metaphysical patience, the fact that there is uncertainty of the future. We don't know what our actions actually have as outcomes. Indirect, secondary outcomes means that we should be very sort of humble or patient in our activities within complex systems, because we just don't know what's going on. He also discusses the idea of indirect mutualism as sort of an undercurrent. I think those are interesting concepts in that regard. So you're always trying to develop more redundant relationships to basically stave off the worst outcome if you head towards a disaster or a dead end. And then maybe just a very quick reaction to what Andrea said. This kind of bothered me, in fact, saying that the internet is leading to less niches and not more. I disagree very, very severely with this. I would say I grew up on the internet. Most of what I have learned, read, and my intellectual development was due to the internet. There are lots of mailing lists and IRC, very old-fashioned chat protocols still being used by many people. So I know you're probably talking about sort of the Facebooks, the behemoths. And the funny thing is, I think these things don't really work so well online. And you see the recent stumbles of Facebook, renaming itself Meta, Netflix, and its problems with its continual growth model shows, I think, that these types of traditional sort of monolithic models don't really work in this two-way street of the internet. So that's just my critical response to that.
Okay, who's got their hand up? Lucia.
Yeah, so I think that Caroline's question about the idea, the problem of how can we speed or make more efficient the network of knowledge production, let's call it that way. Whatever is co-author networks or papers or other forms of knowledge production. I think that this question could be fruitfully reformulated within, from a modeling point of view, within Kaufman's approach to complexity. Because in Kaufman's approach, the idea is just relating what could be recalled evolvability and network evolvability. That is, the basic idea is that if the density of the network is too low, then the network is static and at the extreme does not evolve in any way. If it is too much dense, the density is too high, then it's chaotic. So nothing can be retained, no, nothing can be consolidated somehow to generate new offsprings or whatever, no, in biological terms. So his idea of the edge of chaos as the best condition for evolvability, I think it's very, very interesting and fruitful also for your question, Caroline. I mean, transfer about knowledge networks. Now, so this question, I was thinking about that in last years, just from this point of view, and it seems to me that there are two interesting directions to apply that model, that approach to knowledge networks. There's one is I mean, it's just empirical. That is test. I mean, look at what happens actually, no, in some networks or other networks, who is producing more, at least in terms of what. For instance, I'm working on studying universities as examples of knowledge network generation. And so the question is just then becomes very empirical and methodological. So how do you measure productivity? How do you measure the output, and et cetera, et cetera? But that can be done very well. I mean, it's a pretty precise empirical approach to the problem. There is already some results, at least I applied to my university, and there is a first case at least on which to work. And the other direction is more theoretical and just about modeling, because Kaufman's approach was very, I mean, it was just grounding the basic points of the model. And he was considering basically density and the rules of combinations, you know, for activating the nodes. There is the truth tables, basically, you know, so the 16 combinations to activate a node, and also some, let's say, 2 or 3 other parameters that was just including hierarchy in the sense of forcing the activation in some direction, that is excluding other possibilities of activation. I mean, there is technicalities, maybe if it's interesting, we can discuss later. I mean, the point is that a lot could be done to enrich this model. And actually, it's going this type of enrichment of the model. I mean, considering more aspects, actually, many aspects that are making with the same parameters a network more or less evolvable.
So that's a fascinating point of discussion, Lucio, and I would love to talk to you more about it. In part because in my own research, and this may help us also with triple contingency or the application of modeling. But what I found in my own university, Ohio State University, a very large research university, is that most of the people at the university are working internationally and not with each other. And not even within the state, right? So because the international level is so attractive, that and so focused on elitism, that people tend to work internationally rather than even nationally or locally. And so I wonder then, does the local level starve as a result of more elite? You bring in more elite people because you want to raise the rankings of your university and raise the rankings. And then the more you do that, you attract other elite people. And then ultimately then your university is connected at the international level, but is starving at the local level. So I think that that might be one, maybe that's an empirical question even about the efficiency of networks, right? So on one hand, you could say, well, the self-organizing nature of the network is great because it does, in fact, kick up a lot of new ideas. On the other hand, it has this dynamic where people want to work internationally and get credit for that. And not so much credit for doing work locally. And so I wonder about the knowledge system and its effectiveness in that way. So it would be very fun to talk about that and see if there's something in there.
Sorry, just to add, we can deal it as a network of networks. That is, you can take an academic system of a country or even of a larger region, even let's say Europe or the US, as a network of networks. Where I mean, depending on the level on which you are investigating, because you can look at zoom in at the single university network and look at what is produced there, or you can look at, you can consider each university as a node of a larger network, and so looking at the meta dynamics, I mean the dynamics at the meta level of the network of networks. So there are many combinations can be done.
Caroline, in one of your earlier answers, you mentioned the importance of curiosity and the ways in which the sort of metastability of the networks can impact on curiosity. What is curiosity? Can that be accounted for in this same kind of transpersonal, transindividual way that that sort of runs through Loet's book? I mean, this is why this discussion about Freud is so important, I think, because somehow we've got to grapple with this. We've got to grapple with that sort of burning desire to discover new stuff, and I'm not sure just sort of connecting people up, just connecting nodes up is going to do it.
Mark, let me ask you, you've reflected on this Freudian concept in the beginning of Loet's book, chapter, which I also thought was a very interesting way to open the chapter. What does it mean? What is the meaning to you, and what question emerges?
Well, I'll tell you what I've gained from this, and so these are really the reflections of Tolkien Parsons on Freud, and they seem to me to be extremely insightful because it's to do with the role of the superego and how Freud saw the superego. Now, Parsons' insight, and I think it's probably correct, is the superego must be social. You know, it's this social sort of injunction to say, you know, basically, don't do that, and do, you know, these are the injunctions, the social injunctions to say this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And in Freud, it starts with, you know, shitting basically, and it moves on from there. Now, the Freudian psychodynamic model is obviously, I mean, he had this sort of, again, three parts: the ego, the id, the superego, in a sort of dynamic balance. If part of that is social, if it is basically, it could be Luhmann's social system, can we be more specific about the relations between that social system and what Luhmann sort of broadly calls the psychic system, but maybe perhaps we have to think about a little bit more?
Since you asked the question, Mark, yes, we can. And there is actually a group in England, is the object relations branch of psychoanalysis, that took up this question further. And Lakoff and Johnson even injected some of their ideas in this, where they say the superego is actually the adult who is towering above the baby. And this thing that's literally above it, and that the baby kind of internalizes it and then project it back on society. And then we have the great chain of being, that is kind of a cultural image of a hierarchy. So this is a reference to what Jerome said earlier
Yeah.
about heterarchies. Dus that the hierarchy is actually a baby level view of the world that has been projected on society, become reified, and that we're now dealing with how to not become the prisoner of this
Yeah.
baby level thinking, and that is object relations. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to. I know people want to ask questions, so I'm going to back out. But the problem I have with some of the psychological explanations or the psychological discourse is that it misses this extremely important point, which it runs all the way through the book, that the thing is transpersonal. And I think that insight is correct, and I think it's our greatest sort of chance of a really defensible science of social and individual imagination. I really, that's why I think this book is so important. But this particular topic, this particular issue, is one that I don't have a grasp on, and I just think that we need to think more about this. Anyway, on that point, I can't remember now who's put their hand up first. Larry.
I have a question, probably for Caroline. Could be for anyone else. As I read this chapter, and in fact the book, and I try to strip away all the sides, the side stuff, the peripheral things, all interesting and important, but try to get to the core, to the basic idea. It seems to me, and this is what my question is, am I correct or not? It seems to me that the quantitative measurement and its analysis are not just history dependent, but all about history. I mean, it seems to be a model of history in the case of knowledge formation and evolution. I guess the question then is, if that's so, then the value of this in formulating policy or making other decisions, it requires that we assume that history applies to the present and the future. In other words, that the trends or those dynamics or those models will continue to be the case. Is that correct?
So I would certainly jump in, although I would be interested in others' interpretations. So at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about the ego, and the ego in both time and out of time. And obviously the ego in time is influenced by a lot of social factors. And in network theory, we might talk about it as path dependency, right? There are many reasons why we've come to a certain point in time, and that's dependent on certain paths, and we've been constrained, both constrained and enabled. And so one of the things I think that becomes useful to us, let's say, as we think about the usefulness of being able to measure the system, is that, as Lucio, I think, did a good job of talking about the fact that, on one hand, if you can be too free, and so free that, nothing is retained. And then you can also be too constrained, in which nothing new is allowed or enabled. And so somewhere in the middle, right, of that kind of social structure, the social order that we seek to both create, participate in, we want a system that allows for curiosity. And I think Jerome posted The Economy of Esteem, and that comes through in like Richard Whitley and Merton and others who talk about the kind of economy of attention or economy of reputation that drives a lot of what academics do, for example, researchers do, in order to get resources, you have to be recognized, right? And the more you're recognized, the greater the resources are that come to you. And so really, in a lot of ways, social order is based on both resources and reputation and a kind of interaction between them. So obviously, there is a historical or historicity in there, and then Loet has a footnote in there to Popper on historicism, and the question of historicism is in the chapter as well. But I see this chapter as actually trying to talk about the individual outside of the historical context, that to talk about the ego, alter ego relationship as structural rather than personal. So and this gets also, I think, to Mark's question too, that the chapter, I think at the beginning, it does talk about that, and also elsewhere in the book talks about that our culture is introjected into our personalities and in ways that completely create us. So in other words, it's very hard for us to separate our ego, right, from our social self. But that Loet wants to consider social communication or communication above and beyond the social influences. And in other words, in order to measure it, you have to be able to objectify it in some way, although he doesn't use that word. So I don't know if that answers your question. I do think there is some need to recognize that it's really only in the communication structure that we work in that science exists, right? So I think Robert Boyle made this observation, or maybe it was Hooker many, many centuries ago, that, you know, it has to have been that through all of history, people have fallen upon these scientific facts, right, or truths, and people have recognized them, but they didn't write them down. And so as a result, they didn't formulate into any sense of knowledge or understanding of a shared nature. So and it is only in writing it down, and you know, this comes out in the original Invisible College, who talk about the fact that they write it down and make it evidence-based, and that in the process of developing evidence-based knowledge that's codified, right, that we can actually create science. Before that, before we have a codification, we don't have science. So so I think obviously there's some historicism in there, because we historically write things down and collect them into understandings and we add meaning to it. But then I still think we're still back at the question of how do we structure these things so that we can both remain stable or have stabilization as well as novelty within the system.
Okay, Jerome.
So actually, my point goes back to something you, Mark, was saying, but I thought that was a really excellent observation there, Carolyn, so I don't want to steamroll over what you were just saying. So, and maybe also to complement that, I'm not sure if the focus on Freud is what, and you know, Loet may correct me here, is what is really as central. As I understand it, Loet continually throughout this book, I think the quote comes 4 or 5 times. So obviously, if this is of importance to him, mentions a quote by Freud at a sociological conference where he compares his activity to a barge master who's hugging the coast, not really looking at the sort of the friend of mine who has a boat says the third dimension of going out into the sea. And so I in some sense, I think these notions of trauma and obsessions that Freud has are actually rooted in past experiences and fear, even the fear of death and so on. So this notion of the double contingency that Loet is bringing in is really, I would say it's at a different level. And so you have this hyper incursion that's happening from the future. How do we convince then? I guess the question then would be how to translate those activities down to an individual level. So people who are affected by traumas, who are affected by the fear of death, or you know, Friedrich Hayek's fear of the road to serfdom, and other other types of fears, how does one then uproot, so to speak, some of these experiences and incur new types of visions or imaginaries, as Castoriadis would say. And I just had a quote here from Gregory Bateson talking about a redwood forest, saying that it has no single purpose. It works towards optima, not maxima. Its needs are satiable, and too much of anything is toxic. Sorry, my eyes are a little bit shot. So yeah, so maybe the metaphor of the redwood forest it would be a good one in this context. I'm not sure what that contributes.
Let me build in your, I'm sorry, okay?
It was Jamie and then Richard.
Really?
Oh, sorry. Richard,
I think I had my hand up quite a while ago, but that's okay.
It's a lighter color. I'm sorry, I didn't see it on your background. Jamie,
Oh, okay.
you go first and then Jamie.
Okay, so yeah, I just was wondering, okay. So actually I want to follow up on Jerome's comment and what you brought up. And I want to introduce it from a slightly different way. The idea of understanding the trauma and why people do research, I think, is really critical. And I think that's an important part, and I'm glad you brought that up. And what I want to share with you is an experience that we're having. It's actually going to be an article that just got accepted in PLOS One. It's about a medical school, University of Michigan Medical School. Now, the interesting thing is that people go into medicine, not necessarily novelty seeking. It's because many of them have had a trauma in their life. Somebody died of some disease, and they get dedicated to really try and help others with that disease. So the motivation, the psychological motivation for many people in medical school is not necessarily novelty seeking. But as Caroline pointed out, the university is now set up to reward you for highly rewarded papers and highly influential journals, which essentially reward novelty. And so what we did is we looked at the proposals that all of the researchers were submitting to funding agencies, and which ones were accepted and which ones were not rejected. And this is 25,000 proposals. And what you saw was a consistent rejection of the requests to help people by funding agencies across the board. It wasn't just race and gender, but just to help people. Now, the nice thing is that the dean of the school is going to use this to totally change their research strategy, because they now have the data that says our own people are motivated not for awards. They're actually motivated to help people. That is a really fundamental shift that goes back to your issue about why are people in research in the first place.
Yeah, so what's going on?
What?
What's going on when that happens? We know that happens. What's going on?
Yeah, well, in a sense, actually, so the neat thing with this idea of actually collecting that information of what people wanted to do by what they actually proposed and was rejected. And this is the first time that this has been done from the point of view of a university trying to ask requests. It's an intriguing idea that I think raises, I'm more of a measurement person. It raises that question of how do you capture what it is people want to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to share that because it goes to that very subtle question about what it is that researchers want to do versus the system that they're involved in, which are the other actors that Loet talks about in the triangle. The funders, the regulators that want to, to me, the funders are almost trying to justify that they spent their money well by saying we gave it to somebody who's famous. That means we did our job right. And that's not necessarily a good idea. We all know that. But because you have a system that has that feedback, and one of the members of the system of the feedback actually rewards and reinforces certain kinds of behavior, you get a negative feedback for those that want to have a different direction. So I'm glad you brought that up, because this idea of what it is that people want to do is, and a list and a further understanding of that, I think is really, really important. So I just want to, also with that idea that it might be rooted in that social or that super ego. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I mean, the only thing, I know Jamie wants to ask, but we slip back into this very agentic language, and that's what Loet is trying to get away from in the book. So there's a real challenge as to how to account for these agentic things, which are clearly extremely important, but to do it within a framework which is trans-individual.
Yeah, very hard.
Can I just add in here one observation from my own research, and that is that when I interview individual researchers, they have many, many reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. Some want to make their grandparents proud. Others, brother died of a disease, or, a bridge collapsed in their town. And these kinds of personal motivations really have nothing to do with the system that they operate in, right? So the individual people may be motivated certain ways, this way, that way, but in order to get the money, right, you have to become disciplined. You have to, quote unquote, discipline yourself into a certain way of operating. This is what I think Dick was talking about a little bit, but you have to speak a language in a way that others will reward. So you can't necessarily write a grant proposal saying like, hey, my brother died of leukemia, and that's why I want to look into leukemia, right? So, so this is, I think, where we see a kind of a split between the agency of individuals. A lot of times agents operate in a system they don't even understand. So you could ask them, how does this system operate and what part do you plug in? And they don't know, right? They just start continuing to do what they do, right? Just as we market agents go and buy things that we need, and we don't think about the overall market, right? And so I think it's the same way in science, that we have individuals who operate completely without understanding the system they operate in. In my case, or I think in Dick's case, right, we're trying to shed light on how the system operates so that those individual people, especially those in charge of maintaining it or funding it, have an understanding of how they might be influencing that system to operate in certain ways. I'll pass.
That lack of understanding is the second contingency, though, isn't it? So if we did understand it, why would we do anything?
Can you be a little more specific? I don't really, I saw the second contingency.
Because of multiple loops, in the network, it gets frozen. That's the whole thing. If I think of an ecology, I'll think of a lot of feedback loops in it. And you may see one that says, that's not when we want to change that. But this one's connected to this one. This one's connected to this one. This one's connected to this. And I'm talking about just simple triadic feedback loops in an ecology. That to me is what I find most fascinating, is to try and understand these systems in these kinds of simplistic, a triangle is sufficient. You could do it 4, but it becomes harder to kind of conceptualize it. And how they interact, and how no matter what, you see one doesn't work, that's because it's embedded in another one. I mean, the funder has got somebody that they're answerable to. And if they said, I funded it because they gave me a nice story and I liked them, they're going to lose their job, okay? And so, or the university, who is responsible for promotion and tenure, is really, the actual people that are making that decision just don't want to get beaten up by saying, you're unfair. So they have to rely on metrics, because they don't want to face that fear of anger from people. Okay, I mean, this is so you have all these networks in there that are not characterized, and that's what makes different ecologies. So each university and I'd like to look at research community, because I think disciplines are too big. And journals aren't, to me, representing areas of knowledge, but they go okay as a surrogate for now. But whatever you call it, your unit of analysis, it has these series of feedback loops, its own ecology that is path dependent. So some are swampy and some are dry.
You color these things really beautifully, Richard. It's great. Jamie, you've been waiting for ages. I'm sorry.
Yes, I would like to give an alternative view, and I don't know to which extent it resonates with Caroline, but I thought I heard a little bit in her, and that this Loet is torn between whether it should go transpersonal or whether it should go Popper. And Popper is telling us about objective knowledge as artifacts that we all can look at and we're using them. So there is nothing transpersonal or mysterious about it. It's very tangible. And that is also how I understand Richard's work. He's working with the most tangible thing. I mean, not maybe the most, but definitely a book, a paper. It's tangible. Now it has become a laptop, a hard drive, somewhere a farm of servers, but it is very tangible. And so the Loet is looking at that interaction dus between us and our objects. And I think he engaged with this argument of the transpersonal because he was out there. There's a group of people who decided they were going to experiment with it. But the Popperian dimension is that Popper is saying it's not falsifiable. The very definition of transpersonal means is impossible to see because otherwise it would be personal. And that is what I think is something that's dividing the cybernetic community, because by people who actually kind of grasped with this reality that transpersonal is actually a movie on the back of our eyeballs. That is a concept that someone introduced to kind of say we imagine a world, and it's called idealism in philosophy. And then people respond and say it's not all in your head, there is a reality. But instead of saying that's either or, to kind of say that's a distinction. So we come as Richard beautifully illustrated with the example, but also Carol, there is a drive, there is intentions, there is a commitment, there is expertise, but it's all happening at the individual level. But what Thomas Kuhn showed and Ludwig Fleck is it's not really the individual genius who is the innovator, but it's actually the network of interactions. But it are interactions among individuals. And span of control is actually an individual level concept that has kind of disappeared, but I think it's extremely useful. Like how many relations can you have productively that you maintain? And actually, Mark, that gets back to your friendship. Friendship is something you invest in, and that's not at the transpersonal level that can be explained. No, that's the individual level and the manner that the clock is ticking. So to wrap up my comment, so I do see Loet actually embracing slowly or hesitantly or undecidedly Popper's concept of the artifact or knowledge embedded in artifacts, and how we are interacting with our artifacts. And I see there's still an opportunity to think about this at the individual level, but we have a system, and that's where there's the discussion about the other or the alter ego or whatever it's called. We have other people that have their own set of expectations, and they may have their own private networks, and they may have intentions that are completely different from mine. So what the resistance I get is not from the transpersonal level, but that's actually from me not being properly connected with other people. So, Caroline, I'm curious whether you recognize anything of value in what I said.
Those are just fascinating insights and ideas. And I love this question about interaction with artifacts. So it just recalled for me Basala's concept of the evolution of science, in which he talked about science evolves from very, very practical, kind of physics and medicine, and then into much more kind of ephemeral and difficult to measure and difficult to understand sciences. And in a way, we're kind of at the outskirts of the far end of the hard to understand and hard to measure sciences. So, and really in the social sciences where things are doubly hard to measure. But are they still real? I think, gets back to Kuhnian question, are they still real? Even if they necessarily can't be falsifiable or so I think this is where Loet's book does make a contribution to us as a community, because he's challenging us to model and measure it, right? And in that process, and he talks about it in chapter 9 too, that in the process of modeling, you actually have to make some statements and assumptions. And then, it doesn't mean it's true or not. It's just that once you lay it out there, then you can begin to question it. And so, actually creating the model, then we can see how much it reflects the ways in which society is organized or not. And then we go back to our assumptions about, when we see how the model works or doesn't work, then we can go back to our assumptions and tweak them, change them, and revise them so that we can see, does the model get any closer to what we actually see in the observable world?
Okay, Klaus.
Well, I have to admit that I'm not fully understanding chapter 9. There are lots of questions, but one of the fundamental one is to me, and that comes in the discussion, what is social? Now, I do understand the difference between, let's say, a psychological approach and something that goes beyond that. But to me, I think social begins with language. When we talk with each other, have different kinds of languages. And the kind of things that I'm interested in is actually discourse. The discourses within a discipline, within science, are very different. And people from different discourses, even within psychology, within sociology, if you want, they don't talk to each other. And you can say that a network is actually governed by a particular type of discourse. And so there's a dynamics that certain kind of discourses pop up, raise interesting questions, solve things, and disappear. And we know the history of many of the sciences. That is what it is. And Thomas Kuhn is one, but I personally like others. But the thing is that it's very difficult for me to make works of science without seeing what is the dynamics behind that. And that has to do, as I was saying, with different schools, with different discourses that cannot really talk with each other, and to measure this all in one set of equations or one kind of networks is, to me, very limiting. So I am not so sure how to read that. Well, maybe I leave this with that. There are lots of things that, one of the issues to me, for example, what is knowledge? I mean, that is too simplistic to say that we have knowledge networks. We don't, I mean, if you go to the politics in the United States, the Republicans have a different kind of knowledge base than the Democrats. But that is politics. But even in the sciences, knowledge is very different. Some people, I would say, to me, knowledge has something to do with practice. You mentioned, I forgot who, medicine. Well, knowledge, it has to do with practice. And that is different from, let's say, scholarly knowledge about history. So I think to put this all into one bag and then measure show the networks, that is kind of, I don't know what to say about this. If this would be limited to, let's say, one kind of structure, one kind of discourse, that would make a lot of sense.
Can I thank you for that? Can I just maybe ask you to clarify, because in a previous presentation in this session, you talked about the fundamental importance of conversation. So on the one hand, we have language, and on the other, we have conversation. Which would you say?
Well, language I mean, I think language it emerges in the practice of conversation.
Okay. All right.
Yeah? So it's not, to
okay.
me, language is not in a dictionary. It's what emerges there. But the point is actually that certain terms, if we look at the terms that people use, the kind of concepts they have, that is often described in language, or I would say in discourse.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, conversation is a process, and
Yes. Yes.
that's very important. I think that we are talking about processes, really.
Yes, but conversation is a very special kind of discourse, interaction, in a way where one is particularly open to the others, respects others, etc., etc. And that is not always the case when you look at different schools within one discipline.
Okay.
So
right,
if I could just join in here, because in Loet's chapter, he does talk about this fact that Klaus is bringing up. And I think it's worth perhaps even us understanding it a little bit better, because he talks about, how the social, how Durkheim develops the concept of the social as something that can be studied, as a phenomenon that can be studied over and above the psychological, right? And so in a way, what we see then is kind of this creation of a subsystem above the psychology being established, and then it enables kind of a degree of freedom and understanding of a phenomenon of social, right? And again, kind of getting back to the hierarchies or hierarchies. But then, and I'll answer to Klaus's also his comment, and that is that, one of the things I think that Loet talks about is that in order to have a conversation, we have to develop some extent of shared meaning or shared information, right? And so the individual has an expectation. So I have an expectation now in expressing something that you will understand or take away some part of that, and then perhaps I add something to it, right? So you are the alter. So the ego and the alter interact with some expectation that there'll be a shared understanding, but then there's also a level of uncertainty in the communication, right? So and that uncertainty is also a subject, of course, we know is of great interest to Loet, and how one would measure even uncertainty in communication. So I do think that, and then I think from there, Loet then talks about the fact that if we start with that communication, not the individual people, but the communication itself, right? And then look at that communication and look at the extent to which, let's say, meaning and uncertainty are combined in that communication. Then we can begin to talk about the social level of communication that I think at least Loet's talking about in this chapter.
Yeah, but I think the word social covers so many things. It covers terrorism, it covers science, it covers everything. And that is too limited to start even developing models of what is going on.
Yeah. Is it transduction? If you were to look for a word that described this sort of process, that's perhaps more general than conversation, is it transduction?
Construction.
Construct.
Yeah.
No,
Yes.
transduction.
Okay. Well,
Mark?
I mean, every conversation is different and produces different kinds of, if you want, artifacts. And the artifacts may be entirely social within the connections between the participants. It may be also very concrete objects that come out, or publications, etc., etc. But they are very different depending on whether you are a psychologist, whether you are a terrorist, or whether you are a physicist, or whether you're a sociologist. These are all very different kind of knowledges, if you want.
I would like to point out the metaphor, the dramaturgical metaphor I developed in conversation with Klaus, or that Klaus pointed out to me. There you have the gestalt switch, or the backdrop switch from one backdrop to another. So when you use the word social, actually on the back of our eyeballs, we have a screen that we kind of say, this is what we mean by social. And that we then, as Klaus points out, we really need to check in with each other whether we're using the same screen. And Dus what we need is some course at the university where they kind of help us understand how we're switching screens all the time, and how that actually plays itself out in the history of science, because the dramaturgical metaphor it has been around, but it definitely is not the most visible metaphor in our literature.
It reminds me, sorry, Jamie, have you?
I meant to say, go ahead.
It reminds me, this discussion now reminds me of Gordon Pask's definition of cybernetics as the art and science of defensible metaphors. And we would kind of really need, right, Jerome.
Yeah, so to what Margareta or Jamie was saying earlier on the limits of, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something along the lines of the limits of what individuals are able to achieve even within their local networks, or academic networks, or to what extent are we able to move beyond our own sort of limited horizons and join together. Of course, thinking about Dunbar's number, these types of things. I think one of the interesting things that Loet discusses in this book, or that would follow, would be the utility of methods of organizing systems, I guess. He discusses things like autopoiesis and so on. So I think this is one of the fascinating aspects of Homo sapiens, of our species, is that we are able to abstract from ourselves and the present and sort of build organizations. So there are many types of organizations, and you could develop organizations that cover other organizations and that move beyond those types of structures. So just one example, and also to what Klaus was saying, just looking at the particular explicit practices when one is referring to different terms. Say the notion of knowledge would mean something different in one context than another. By the way, Klaus, I found that comment very simpatico. I actually once brought a philosophy course to a screeching halt, asking the same question. The professor was very frustrated, wrote some formulas on the board, and then she canceled class. So that was a great success. I think one example of such a type of an organizational innovation is Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. And actually the quote about the redwood trees in an essay by Gregory Bateson on Alcoholics Anonymous. And he says, in fact, the simple purpose of AA is directed outwards and is aimed at a non-competitive relationship to the larger world. The variable to be maximized is a complementarity and is of the nature of service rather than dominance. So that's one example, of course, in practice, where we have the problem of alcoholism. Of course, there's also Narcotics Anonymous. And Carolyn, to your sort of lamentations about the limited local activities of Ohio State academicians, I would, bring in again Unanovich's notion of metaphysical patience and sort of juxtapose that with the very precarious political economy in Ohio, which is tending in quite extreme directions. And if these two facts are not quite related, my partner was on the board of a multinational company whose American headquarters is in Cincinnati, and always commented that the majority of Ohioans don't have a passport. Even more have never actually left the country. So is there a relationship between the lack of intellectual even discourse? You have institutions like in Cleveland, you have the Evergreen model and so on. So so there's some ideas.
Okay.
Just real quick, what's even more interesting is to study the University of Missouri.
Oh, yeah. Why the University of Missouri particularly?
Caroline and I know a woman named Melissa Flagg, who was very involved and very high up in the Department of Defense and MacArthur Foundation. But she comes from Missouri, and she's going back there, and she's struggling with the fact that the people in the university there really don't do very little that has anything to do with Missouri. And this is about the local service that you do as opposed to the searching for prizes that are external. And it's a real problem, I think, in many of the university systems in the United States, is they don't necessarily serve their local communities because of the system that's been set up. So Ohio, at least, I think, has a large set of highly educated people in the state that you build on. Missouri is more not known for that. So, sorry, that's just a side comment.
Mark Twain was from Missouri, so don't diss Missouri.
Yeah, and he moved out as soon as he could.
Okay. We've had some interesting comments in the chat from Velikovsky of Newcastle. I'm sorry, that's all I've got to go on. Do you want to say something? Maybe you can't.
Why don't you read it?
Okay, Mike and video is not okay. Jerry, you wanted to say something.
Oh, well, actually, it relates to that comment as well. In how one is using the term system in this context as a social system, and the focus on the role of universities as part of that triple helix. I guess I come from an old school who took a university more in the sense of John Cardinal Newman, but that seemed to be about as remote from Carolyn Wagner's view of a university as the opposite pole almost. If I understand Carolyn's discourse correctly, she sees the university, and particularly her own university, as a source of empowerment of entrepreneurs who have the possibility of creating fame and wealth and perhaps some self-satisfaction as being the principal objective of that system. Now, I've overstated this a little bit intentionally because it does shine a light on the entire discussion in Loet's book, at least from my perspective of it. And that is that traditionally, a social system was built around a set of institutions, a set of operational cooperations. In other words, rather than using entropy as a measure, cooperations using work as a measure of how society worked. And this notion apparently is obsolete now in terms of the modern university. I just am somewhat taken back because it seems to in part also to have strongly influenced the way the governments are operating, particularly currently in the United States, that there is sort of an abandonment of, if I would call them, the intellectual history of Western societies, and replacing it by fame and wealth of the individual. So that's a very extreme view that I'm presenting here.
Yeah.
But I wanted to focus the trends that I see or I heard in Carolyn Wagner's presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you want to necessarily personalize an attack on modern universities. No.
I certainly didn't mean it to be a personal attack of any sort.
Yeah.
Because I have colleagues who are also in that mold and model of behavior. So it's in no way meant to be, Carolyn, please forgive me if I've insulted you in any way or your university. It's just a perspective of how I see the system operating at present.
I think you won't meet many people who don't say that these places are in trouble. But Caroline.
No, I'm just taking in the observations. I'm not going to defend, but I do think that within universities, the reward structure is such that the reward system is quite based on indicators of recognition and reward, so that if you bring in resources such as grant money, if you bring in other kinds of attention such as citations or high marks for teaching and so on, you advance in your career. And these things are considered part of what the university looks at as its reputation as well. So they look at their rankings, and they look at the amounts of money that they bring in and so on. So while on one hand, you could say, again, do people go into university level teaching in order to enlighten, the freshman 18-year-old who is wanting to know more about the world, or to gain fame and fortune as a famous academician? Well, maybe there's all of those motivations may exist in the same person, but the question, I think, of having to look at the motivational structure and reward system, then I think we're talking about something different from what drives an individual to what organizes, or what organizing forces are influencing people within the organization itself.
So I wanted, since Jerry gave us this picture of a university, I want to offer an alternative picture inspired by Gregory Bateson, but also Oakeshott, like some English philosopher, and actually Richard Rorty, for those who ever read Rorty. The university as a place where the conversations of humanity take place in feedback, feed-forward processes with the help of the artifacts that Caroline is studying, and for which Caroline is developing models that we can better use those artifacts to keep track of those conversations. But those conversations take place among human beings, and there is a president to a university that really set the course. And I'm living in the shadows of Cornell, and there's all sorts of drama there that you clearly see the interpersonal dynamics, and there is a board of regents. So I'm just trying to bring it all down to feedback, feed forward, all the different subcultures that are negotiating. So there's another interpersonal or individual level term. The better we are at negotiating, the more, how can I say, if we have a drive, we can realize it. If we're bad negotiators, we create negative energy that creates unhealthy loops, and now we can come up with some transpersonal theory to kind of say something else is responsible, it wasn't me. But actually, if we look back, then we can say, yes, it was you, but not 100% you. It was your education that you got, and your education never prepared you to become a good negotiator. And so it gets back to this feedback, feed forward loops that I think Loet is talking about in his book.
So Margareta, do you think that there would be an improvement if we went back to the model of university in the time of Adam Smith, where professors had to solicit their students for money, basically to pay for lectures?
Well, Jerome, if sorry, just you heard me say feedback, feed forward. So the feedback comes from the artifact, but it's really feed forward that we're doing, and feed forward depends on where we are here and now. And by the way, Loet kind of, or Caroline picked that from the chapter that he say we need something outside time, and that's like the transpersonal, I guess, as a reference point. But I think what Jerome is indirectly making a reference to is the difference between transcendental truths and imminent truths. So the transcendental is somewhere hanging in the sky, like the transpersonal, always true forever and ever. And the imminent truths are the ones that we all discover inside ourselves through our practices, but then that we discuss and share and codify, that I think what Loet is getting at. So the immanent truths get codified, and then other people evaluate and judge, and they get either they become how can I say, they become more visible because they move through the network and more people join them. but there is, of course, a tricky question here, because there can be also a manipulator in the system. And now we get this information, and then it looks like an imminent truth, but it's actually disruptive, manipulative use of the system. And it's for that reason we really need courses in the humanities, or I don't know what to call it, to kind of help people understand a feedback feed forward system and how it works, and that there may be actors that don't have good intentions, but that you can actually recognize that early on if you're aware of their existence. And I think that's a reference to Richard's work in intelligence, with the intelligence communities.
There's an interesting question here, I think, thinking about universities, because one of the qualities of universities, which has always been incredibly important, is what people call collegiality. You know, the way that staff work together, help each other out, collaborate, and so on. And I think it's probably not unfair to say that the level of collegiality in institutions over the last 30 years has gone down. Now, maybe Loet's work actually can shed some light on why this has happened.
If I may inject again, I think we don't need loads of work, but just a calculation, a calculator helps. We only have 24 hours in our day, and we only have maybe 8 hours, or some people only need 4 hours sleep, but let's say 8 hours that we can spend on the job. And relationships, you need to invest. And so collegiality, that's a process you have to invest in, and it requires time. And so there's this trade-off. How do I spend my time? Will it be on the research project that leads to a paper, really with the goal on the paper, and everything else is on the side, or do I invest in the relationship? And so that is the dean of the department that kind of also gives little messages like what will be rewarded. And so that's the reason collegiality disappears. I guess it's
I mean, if I can be more precise, I would say that the loss of collegiality is basically a loss of redundancy within the institution, and the drive for efficiency has driven the decline in redundancy.
Oh, can you repeat that, the last sentence again? The
Damn it.
drive for efficiency.
The drive for efficiency has led to a decline in redundancy, as you would expect in any system. A lot of Loet's work is about redundancy. It's about effectively the niche of redundancy and how that stimulates growth, and new ideas, new thinking.
Okay, so
we have an economic system and a model which works against it.
What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you say the word redundancy? I have a hard time attaching one meaning to it.
Well, redundancy has two meanings in the world of universities these days.
Yeah, okay.
They are diametrically opposed.
Well, I think Loet uses it in a very different meaning than the human resource manager uses it.
Well, I think there are underlying a lot of struggles that are long range. I think, for example, I'm in the Annenberg School of Communication. Communication was at some point not a subject. There was a struggle that the social psychologists said, we are dealing with communication. The sociologists said, the sociology of knowledge is all about communication. Well, there was a lot of struggle until there was a money issue that ultimately we got the School of Communication. And that is now, I mean, actually nationally, we have a huge discipline, journalists focusing on communication. There's lots of struggle. And this is not so collegial in every respect.
Can I just add to that? I think that it would be wrong to describe the modern university as just one institution. Having spent, I guess, most of my life now in universities, or maybe not most, but certainly more than half of it. Well, I guess that would be most, actually. Anyway, many years, mostly as a student. But I've seen, what you see is the academic sphere, intellectual debates of different qualities, and then you have the administration. So to me, these are not necessarily even the same institution. Going back to Loet's notion of the triple helix, they seem to have different governing logics. And while, Mark, what you said about the efficiency of the organization seems to be taken from a certain reading of efficiency, we can talk about whatever that means, efficiency. I like Jeffrey Pfeffer's criticism of the notion of efficiency within organizations, but applying efficiency towards reducing the costs of sort of academic chairs, while at the same time, I recall at my time at the University of Alabama, there were huge construction projects building new administrative buildings. You have to house the bureaucracy. And one of my favorite professors, who I dedicate my dissertation to, who's died a few years ago, used to say the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the ever-expanding needs of the bureaucracy. And so this seems to me to be absolutely contradictory to a notion of whatever we mean by efficiency. So I think you have to separate out these two.
No, I mean, what people call efficiency is not efficient. That's the other irony of the whole thing. Caroline.
I'd like to just bring us back to this question of redundancy, because Jamie asked, what does redundancy mean? And I think it would be really interesting. I'd like to hear, before we finish up, what people think of the ideas of redundancy in communication. So in Loet's book, I'll just go to his description here on page 10, where he talks about variation generating mechanisms, right? And that this question about whether all information has meaning or whether there's meaning that's derived from information is a question that he asks. But then he talks about, he argues that the relations between information processing and meaning processing, he sees them as different things, can further be clarified by extending information theory with the calculus of redundancy. And now, again, I understand, and Jamie's good question about how do we understand it? But as I understand it, redundancy has to do with a shared meaning, where we, and Loet talks about this in terms of Shannon uncertainty, right? That redundancy, that we add redundancy in the maximum information content, and that the maximum information content is the sum of information and redundancy. So as I understand it, redundancy is a kind of a shared understanding, and that that only comes from that communication process. So in other words, we can't share a meaning without actually expressing it in a codified term. We have to use some language in order to express it. And so when we come to what we think of as a shared meaning or reduction of uncertainty, then the idea becomes redundant, is how I understand it. But I'd be interested in how other people see that.
Well, I think that in communication is a very different concept. Redundancy is when you say the same thing twice and you could have said it once. Or when the context says already what you articulate. Redundancy is a question of useless information or no information, but using the signals to say the same thing. That is very different from and it said a long time ago, from how Loet defines it. Loet defined it actually as a difference between the channel capacity and the actual use. And that is not redundancy in the communication theoretical sense.
It's interesting though, Klaus, isn't it? Because when we teach, teaching is so much about generating redundancy. It's so much about saying the same thing in many different ways.
Well,
And the more powerful the teaching, the more powerful the communication, it seems the greater the ability of the teacher to generate redundancy.
yeah, I think redundancy is important, particularly since our attention is usually limited to very few things, and to say it twice is important. I mean, redundancy is a very important communication feature.
Imagine a teacher only had one way of explaining something. They'd be crap. It would be
Yeah, well,
rubbish.
that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
I,
Okay.
I encountered the word redundancy for the first time. That was in studies of innovation and innovation or new product development strategies in Japan versus the United States. And that they said that they deliberately encouraged different people kind of developing the same product. So they didn't all say this one way and now everyone goes. No, they kind of give a freedom. And then by itself, kind of the best product emerged. But that was seen as dus a good thing, just by giving that freedom. Because if you have only one way, then there are all sorts of errors that may creep in. So then afterwards, they need to be fixed anyway. So it's not necessarily more effective. It may be less effective. But so redundancy then didn't mean the same thing. It meant more like variation of the same thing, with the emphasis on the subtle variations.
Yeah, so if redundancy, as you say, is necessary for teaching, that means redundancy is necessary for learning.
Yes, of course.
Exactly the flip side.
Like Gordon Pask actually said this.
Yeah,
There's a wonderful moment.
And that goes back to the question: is are researchers learning from each other?
Yes, and the answer is very often not. I mean, David Bohm, I think, was the person to really point this out.
Then it would really pay, it seems to me, for people interested in social structures to look at the role of redundancies of interactions between the individuals, such that you create some metastability for the operation of the system as a social system. In other words, the repetition of the feedback and feed-forward loops leads to a form of learning that has more metastability associated with it. And there's reason to believe why this is physiologically sound, but that's another issue entirely.
Jerry, can I, without it being a joke, can I ask you to say that again?
Sure. Sometimes I have consistency and sometimes I don't. So the issue is redundancy as a necessary component of developing a dynamically stable system when you have a large number of interacting variables, such that they may destabilize the system. Yeah. And so institutions serve this role to stabilize the overall metastability of the system. And does that clarify what I tried to say? So anyway, to develop these neural pathways in terms of how people learn, you get reinforcement and reinforcement and reinforcement of the same sequence of if you would, neuronal firings. And so the more times that neuron fires, the evidence suggests that the stronger will be its memory. And that's a very remote from the current conversation.
All right.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wander off that far, but
yeah.
This is the notion of well, all sorts of biological concepts, molecular biological concepts emerge from this notion of redundancy.
So what's interesting, just to come back to this question about networks and connection, because I mean, Warren McCulloch made the point that the brain has redundancy of potential command. So many possible, of course, the internet embodies that in our electronic world. connection is it's an arc between two nodes. So theoretically, there's a connection. Why do you need more arcs between more nodes? I think there's something about the context within which we actually make connections in the first place. So it's actually, we tend to look at networks after the event. We see something that's formed as a structure. The biologist saw something that's formed as a structure after the event. But actually, the formation of those structures involves a different kind of process. And I think that's where the redundancy is. That's the learning.
I think Lucio wanted to say something.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, it was just bringing back the discussion to the question of redundancy that we discussed some month ago. If you remember, I was arguing that Loet is using Shannon-like definition and calculation of redundancy, which is based on attributes, not based on relations, not based on connections. And now in this discussion, you are mixing again the two aspects. I mean, redundancy calculated in terms of actors' attributes, or redundancy calculated in terms of relationships, I mean, connections. And that's why you don't understand one another when you are talking about that, because these are two different dimensions on which measuring redundancy. For instance, what you said before, Mark, there is collegiality is increasing redundancy. In terms of network analysis, this is totally true and very precisely measurable. There is just collegiality means adding links between the actors, between the nodes of the network, and so it's increasing density. And it is exactly when density grows over a certain threshold. There is the threshold of efficiency, that is the minimum number of links, that is starting the area of redundancy. And the more links you add over the minimum number of links, which is n-1, that is the n is the number of nodes, that's an efficient network. There is a not redundant network. When you are adding links between the actors of the network, that is the scientists or the members of the university, then you are increasing collegiality, as you said, Mark, and then actually you are increasing redundancy. And it's from the collegiality, it's from redundancy that comes possibly new variety, new ideas, new innovations, I mean, something new. And it again, this is very much consistent, even if Kaufman didn't express it in the same way. But again, with the Kaufman's model, that is when the network, the cell network in his case, but we can transfer perfectly to a knowledge network. When the network is very efficient, the network is not evolvable because it's too stable, too sparse connections. To make it evolvable, you need a base of ordering, which is in network analysis, let's call it clustering, so high clustering. And you have to poison this order with some randomness, with some disorder, which means links, I mean, new links between distant part of the network, of the topology. And that's, if you think about that, that is exactly the definition of small world. So if the network is small world shape, then it's also very much evolvable. And it's the ingredients are a largest part of order, regularity, and some poison, let's call it that way, of distant links, that is creating redundancy, but that type of redundancy between distant clusters.
All right.
See, I would go back to
On that
issue.
note, apologies.
Can I make one addition? Because I would say that from this perspective, you are favoring the notion of randomness versus having the social group working to accomplish something. And I think this is very fundamental in the discussion I've heard today, that if you don't want the social system to function and actually work to accomplish something within its local environment, then add as much entropy to it as you can. Add as much density to it as you can.
Yeah, sorry, if I can add, the question is not only density, but where the density is localized within the network. That is, in general, above the efficient threshold, then it's redundancy. But if you want that the redundancy is also productive in the sense of evolvability, you need that there must be these redundant links must be between distant clusters. That's the theory of small world.
Okay, we're going to have to.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Okay,
may I interrupt everyone? We have a mailing list. It's called cogitata@googlegroups.com. That is the place to continue this discussion, because very important issues were just said right now. And Mark, I'll let you do maybe the wrapping up.
It seems that the length of our discussions is inversely proportional to the number of speakers. So Caroline, thank you so much for being our single speaker. Do you want to quickly just sum up what your thoughts today?
No, I think we should all go back to the text and work from there. I thank you very much for the opportunity to help get the discussion going. It was extremely interesting, and I very much enjoyed conversing with everyone and hearing all the great thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you ever so much. And next time, next month, I can't remember who's talking, but there will be further discussion about this. And we are really honing in on the nub of this stuff, I think. So this is
yeah, Gerard de Zee and Christian, the last name, Gerard just left us, but he will be there. And then also, let me very quickly say, my message got clipped here. Dus the next one is July the 20th, Cultural and Biological Evolution, Christian Gebhardt and Gerard de Zee.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you ever so much.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Caroline.
See you a month from now. Yeah.
Margarete, just to respond, yes? I haven't had time to respond to your email, but I would still give the talk, I guess, in August. It's fine.
Just because you're on the schedule, and and since I have you, so I will be coming to Belgium. The first, I bought the ticket, so now it's real. Maybe the first
week. So there's no more redundancy.
Yeah, well, you never know. But I will be in the first week of August. If you're free, I can come to Brussels, or you come to Antwerp.
I definitely will be. Well, I can't say definitely, but I will most likely be there then. So I am traveling. Until about the later part of July. So about the 20th, the week of the 20th of July, I should get back from Athens. I'm in a conference in Athens, and so starting the end of July, I'll be there. I just got word yesterday of my apartment. I had a sort of a hierarchy, number 1, number 2, number 3, and I got number 1. So I'm very happy. It's about 5 minutes with the bike, 10 minutes walking distance from the palais, from the palace of the we call it the academy. So it's